Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Few seconds to set up my timer. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When you're faced with the unknown, nothing seems easy. All the options that you have seems like could turn you into a worst situation ever. This is what has been faced by all the government during the pandemic. That is, they don't even know whether or not the decision that they'll make for their country will actually solve pandemic or like reduce all of the harm. But they have to make those choices and those options to begin with based on the knowledge that they have. And the outcome might not be desirable, but the fact that they had to make it, I think it's important for us to understand that there is no valid blame or criticism towards them should be put on them. Two positive materials coming from affirmative. Firstly, why exactly the criticism towards the government during the pandemic is invalid? And secondly, why exactly it will stifle the policy making and harm the political climate and therefore we prefer to move away from it. But before that, few pieces of framing to this debate. The first thing I'm going to know is how does this debate actually operate and how does the world on our side looks like? We will imagine that the media are moving away from blaming of the policy implemented to other things, right? How does it look like? It looks like no longer try to say like we should have not actually like closed down the countries, or we should have not closed the hospital, or we should have implemented the mask policy much earlier, or we should have like buy more vaccine to ensure the rollout is better. We're going to move away from all of this thing to something else because the media exists on a very limited spaces. That means that you have to move away from one thing to the other thing. What will be replacing it? I will imagine that moving away from this will look like, number one, you probably focus on the reconciliation and also forgiveness of like the things that has happened. That is to say that you are now focusing instead of like all the fights about like the pandemic, now moving towards that reconciliation of the pandemic and also the unity of the country. Number two, it's about focusing on the future planning of the crisis. That is, you no longer blame like what is the decision that has been made, but rather focusing on what kind of the future decision that we should make to prevent any kind of future harm or future crisis again. Or three, it looks like moving to focusing on the current issue that are more important. Things such as like the economy crisis that is happening right now because of the recession from the pandemic and also like from the Ukraine-Russia war stuff. Or like focusing on the politics issue that exists within your country. For example, like in Malaysia, we have a hung parliament, or in Israel, they also have a hung parliament. Why exactly media is important has a very important role in the society. There are three layers to this which establish all the benefits and the harm in this debate. The first is that because of the media has a very far-reaching power into the society. That is to say, media are able to reach all like part of the society and they're able to actually shape every single like idea and give the knowledge and give the necessary information for people to understand what is going on. And number two, it's the fact that they're able to shape the narrative that exists. They can take a story and make it seems like a most important narrative within the society, which is why we think it's important for them to actually take the proper stance. Thirdly, is the fact that the problem with the media is that they're able to actually like craft the future policy making and political discourse simply because of the fact that it makes all every single time they spend a certain amount of time for the certain amount of airtime for certain issue represent how important that issue is, which is why more people will opt in, will discuss a lot more on certain political issues simply because of the fact that there's a lot of airtime given by the media. Therefore, the media has a very important role. The question in this debate becomes whether or not the media should focus on the blame or should it move on away from it. Two arguments then to propose on our side of the house. Firstly, on the criticism towards the government are invalid. What is the framing of this argument? We're proving in this argument is that the outcome might have not been desirable, but the fact that the decision that they have made at the time was that because of like the state are in the state of like the of confusion and also urgency because they don't know how exactly to deal with COVID-19 because of the fact that this is such a new thing to them and it's also a worldwide pandemic. Therefore, a lot of like the things that they have done is based on the information that they have, and therefore for you to criticize them based on and blame all of the policy that they have implemented is quite invalid. There are three layers why exactly they do not deserve the blame. Number one, in this situation, nobody actually knows what is the right course of action. And we already proved to you based on like what they and most of the time what the course of action that they are taking based on what they believe is right and what exactly they believe is the best for the country at the time. We can see this happen when a lot of countries decided to actually like close down their border simply because of the fact that they want to prevent like the COVID-19 from spreading. But some countries decided not to close their border because they know that the economy are literally dependent on those countries, which means that they're not able to actually like prevent this they're not able to prevent the spread of like the COVID-19, but they have to do that because of like their economy are dependent on that. Secondly, it's the fact that there's an inaccurate information coming from WHO. At the start of like the pandemic, WHO stated that you don't have to wear masks, you don't have to close down your border, you don't have to do all of these things to prevent COVID-19 because of the fact that they thought that COVID-19 wasn't really that important, wasn't really that dangerous to begin with. But the problem is that when a lot of countries actually follows all of the guidelines that has been given by WHO, it causes a lot of harm because COVID-19 are able to spread and it causes a lot of death within those countries. All of this problem would have not happened if that the accurate information coming from WHO are actually being provided. Thirdly, it's the circumstances of their country. The fact is there's certain political climate that exists within the country. Closing down the border might seems very good, but the biggest problem is that a lot of people within the country doesn't seem like it's a good idea because of the fact that it will affect them. When that happens, a lot of time the leaders have to actually choose certain decision or make certain decision based on the interest of like the people. This is why we see a lot of like countries such as within Latin America decided not to close their border because there has been a protest within the country about like closing out the border. At the point where they decided to close the border, it will create a civil unrest which harms the country even worse. We don't think they deserve the blame. The conclusion to this is that while it is true the outcome might have been bad for this country, it is unfair and unnecessary for us to blame all of these things because all the decisions that they have made actually based on what they believe is the right thing to do. We think it's far more important for us to focus on the post-COVID where we move away from the COVID because the COVID pandemic itself already ended. We should focus on other things. Second argument then, why exactly it stifles the policy making and harms the political climate? What are the harms at the point where you focus too much on the blame itself? Four layers to this. Number one, there's too much focus on the pandemic, which has already ended, and much lesser focus on the more important issue. At the point where you put a lot of like your attempt towards like pandemic, you're no longer talking about other important issues, such as like how we are going to recover from the economic crisis, how are we going to solve all this political crisis that happen within the country itself. This is very harmful because when you have the lack of focus on other issues, you are no longer focusing on how the political discourse surrounding those issues, which means there are less possibility of like creating better policy. Second, mudslinging happens on the policy and also the reputation. That is, currently people are using the low-hanging fruit of like the previous government actually harms our country and therefore you should not vote them. A lot of these things takes away all of the credibility of like the government, even though that the government might actually have done a lot of good things as well. This is very harmful because that means that it clouds the mind of the people to choose the wrong, like the government that could actually be worse for them. But thirdly, it's the fact that they overuse the certain credits. So for example, when Trump says that I'm the one who actually implemented the mask policy, he is able to actually use this like narrative to say that, well, you shouldn't vote for like the Democrats because of the fact that I'm the one who actually like prevent the problem within the pandemic. They did not. All of these things can harm the country at the point in terms of like the policy making and also like the election, simply because of the fact that the narrative is very toxic. The comparative on our side of the house, we are not able to actually focus on more urgent issue. This is how you are able to create far more better policy making, and you are able to actually create accountability. And before like the opposition side suggest to us like we need to have accountability. Accountability already exists on our side of the house because there's a lot of election that happens during pandemic where a lot of terrible parties have already been kicked out. And for all those reasons, we are proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the first negative speaker.
I'm going to start the timer first. Wait, I'm going to. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. The biggest arguments of government told you that it is better to leave it out because it is an unknown situation. But I think when we are in unknown situation, at least we could still prevent those to become unknown, that is exactly what opposition is going to bring in the debate, right? So, but before that, firstly, let's characterize what is going to be the trade-off between government and opposition. Because I think government is like, taking it all away, like they want to like integrate it in unity, and they also like want to focus on clinical focus. So I'm going to characterize to you firstly what the pandemic debate currently looks like, right? I think the pandemic debate that is being rolled by the media looks like currently is that you are going to consciously highlighting governmental failure of the policy that you are going to make, and you are going to like consciously checking all of those policies that are going to be made. But secondly, I think it could also look like you're going to consciously like, surveying the people that are impacting the most and how like they are going to form the conclusions of their satisfaction toward the governmental that's going to happen. Firstly, rebut, right? I think the biggest argument told you that most we should focus on pandemic amnesty because we need to focus on another important issue, such as economical crisis or other etc. Firstly, I think it is not mutually exclusive, right? Because the reason is because firstly, I think most likely the ideas of economic and ideas of health are something which handled in a different governmental bodies or like in different governmental ministries. So I think both could still happen anyway in both sides of the house. I just don't understand why, like, just because you are blaming the pandemic amnesty, the pandemic just suddenly are going to stop, right? Because there is no analysis of why it influenced the state incentive in the very first place to change, right? So going to my first argument, right? So why did this principally bad, right? So firstly, on the class donut, it is the governmental negligence. Firstly, it told you that it is most likely not a governmental failure because it is on enforced externalities, right? But I think even if it is enforced externalities, you can still maintain control on how that you are going to mitigate and prevent this to happen in the very first place, right? Because what is the differentiate between Japan and actually Americas, even if like they are in the same unpredictable situation, is exactly upon the way in which the government are having the capacities to control and decide within those kind of particular circumstances. It is upon their personalities and how they handle the predictable circumstances that they are going to make, right? What it means? It means that even if like it is enforced externalities, what is important is not upon blaming those externalities, but by identifying the governmental behavior which actually shaping the way in which they are making these policies in the very first place. But I'm going to easily engage toward it and tell you why it is most likely are exactly the governmental failure for a reason. Firstly, because most likely there is the critical reasons that as to whether or not like most likely the reasons why like a lot of people dying is not because the government cannot make a decision, but because they cannot prevent it in the very first place. It looks like a lot of people dying like because they don't have enough like facility in hospitals, because in the very first place the government does not really engage and not giving attention in hospital, etc. Right? Because of like just because of the governmental arbitrary action, because they want to constantly like focusing upon the economical, therefore they just abandoning the lockdown within those particular places, even if it is already being advised by WHO due to this kind of thing, right? But secondly, I think it is also the inability of the government like to balancing like this kind of between economical and health. So there is exactly the reason why there's like strong of economical recession and people's losing job in the first place. Thirdly, I think it's also like a lot of the thing, there is also like the inconsistency of the state's policies and their behavior. It looks like Trump, which actually coordinating people together in mass in constitutional court during pandemic, right? They're not using the mass like during the conference, etc. Means that there is exactly like the negligence and the failure of the government, especially within those particular action that you are going to have. But fourthly, I think there is also a lot of ministries that are like doing a corruption that is exactly governmental failure due to a weak institutional system which happened during the policy making that are happening. What it shows to you? It shows to you that there is exactly some sort of levels over the government negligence or like the government failure toward whether or not it is exactly something that are happening toward them, right? What it shows to you that critically, right? It shows to you that critically a lot of people on the ground are impacted severely enough, like in a lot of multidimensional way. It looks like they are going to losing their job, like the death of their relative and their family, and most likely they are not getting sufficient compensation currently, like throughout the ability through the governmental compromises, such as job opportunity, such as the compensation for the family relative due to like lacks of facilities or like the building of infrastructure or like enough strict protocol which happen currently, etc. What I think under our side house, most likely this kind of pandemic debate exactly a form of compensation. It is a form of this individual in these people to actually trying to check and maintain the governmental action so that they are going to feel and able to leverage their catharsis of mental health burden that they are consciously feeling within those particular era, within those particular lowest both point in their life, right? So how the pandemic, this kind of dissemination is going to worsen those conditions and those retribution and those compensation toward this individual you all. Because firstly, because like they told you, because it is going to direct the conversation in a different form. So it's like through economical, mean that you are going to completely abandoning this kind of discussion which currently happen, right? Because they're like you are going to suddenly like as media, not again to constantly surveying the people's underground and checking whether or not they are going to already feel satisfied. You're not again like going to observe them, etc., to actually getting there. But secondly, it means that because you are forgiving them, because you are amnestying them, means that you are going to blame it for the externalities, right? Because you are not going to blame the government again in the very first place. I think like at this level, it is also harmful because it means that the people are going, the people that are that feeling that they are actually like getting taken into account because of the decision of the government, exactly does not are going to get any compensation within those kind of particular moments, right? What it means that under their words, it is very likely that people are not going to get the form of compensation that is in the form of compromises, which is already like being handled by the government, like throughout this process that they are already compromised in the very first place. Because it is just like because it is just going to be abandoned in the current in another focus, right? Why this is harmful? Because I think this is harmful because it means that a lot of people underground does not get a reparation of justice, right? They don't get the ability to actually maintaining and checking whether or not the government is exactly already like enforcing a strict protocol like throughout using the messages like in public self-page. It also means that they cannot again like maintaining whether or not there is already like a sufficient capacities like through infrastructure in hospitals so that they can like prevent like just like forgiving the government because making like a lot of their families dying, etc., etc., right? The tipping point is upon the ability for them to maintain and checking in that is most likely just can be handled throughout the media, right? Because the media exactly the one that are going to shape it, means that you cannot again like because most likely this kind of societies does not know where they are going to actually checking this kind of information, right? What it means that this principle of preparation, this principle of competition exactly are the most important thing in this debate, right? Because regardless the practicality that they are going to prove in this debate, regardless that they are able to prove about the economical good, etc., we don't care. We carry here is about the ability for you to answer the compensation, ensuring the people underground is going to get a betterment, right? So second argumentation, why it also are going to worsen the quality of policies, right? Firstly, let's talk about what qualities of policy that we are talking in this debate, right? I think more, if we take upon like governmental premise, we could like talking about the governmental economical growth, etc., right? I think most likely this kind of economical growth that happened post-pandemic is most likely shaped by the influence of pandemic in the very first place, right? Such as like there is a remote control which happening currently. There's also like the economical growth policy which need like fulfill the standard protocol because this is exactly doing this. They want to like attracting foreign direct investment that are going to happen, right? So why it is important? I think it is important to actually consciously focusing upon the pandemic debates because it is exactly the only way for because it is going to be seen as something which is comfortable. It is going to be seen as something which is like providing the safetyness toward the people because a lot of the time the current situation in the after pandemic is exactly full a lot of uncertainties due to like an influx with economical trade which happened or like due to the economic recession. Therefore, it is very important for you to actually consciously making sure that the policy that you are going to make exactly can becoming predictable. The point here is that it is upon the ability for you to actually making the policy which is more to actually handling the unpredictable circumstances is going to be happening, right? Because most likely the pandemic debate exactly focusing upon the ability for you to focus on the unpredictableness that are going to happen, and it is exactly something which is very likely to be happen consciously. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that speech and welcome the second affirmative speaker.
So, hopefully I'm audible. Thank you. One second. Pronounce Arhishem. I'd first like to note that the speaker before me never really engaged with the necessity of these policies. As in, regardless of if they were good policies in the past or not, is it even necessary for the media to even talk about it in the status quo? We gave you multiple layers as to how it is not necessary because urgent problems require urgent solutions, and the media really crafts these policies for a lot of politicians. We argued in the second argument, which is that when you have too much airtime, you really focus more on the past policies in the pandemic as opposed to current issues in status quo, which means that you're less likely going to focus on how the economic crisis affects people now, but rather explain how the pandemic created the economic crisis. Maybe there's some merit to that, but we really need more policy making that is targeted to the economy currently, similarly to issues on identification, on how people, women deserve the right to abort their own babies. This would have never happened in a circumstance where the pandemic discussions dominate a lot of the discourse. The way this is simple, and this is why negative team loses immediately, is because the point in which when you argue everything that is on pandemic, you eliminate any other possible discussion on every other issue because of how the rhetoric surrounding the pandemic is so strong. It's very intuitive. It's very like emotional to look at a lot of people who are dying as a result of COVID, but those things have happened in the past and politicians have already punished through re-election. The problem in status quo now is that women are unable to access abortion, on how people on the ground are unable to get good food because have any food because of the recession that exists in status quo. There is a scale of airtime that happens on current issues exists exclusively on affirmative. That's why we already win this debate, because we have better policy making. Negative team is too late to respond to this. I'll give you an argument as to how pandemic discourse gives credence to the people who made those bad policies, assuming the best case on a negative when there are bad policies. But before that, some responses. They argued in response to our invalidity of these criticisms by saying that, well, the government is negligent in a lot of circumstances, and how you look at Japan and you compare that to the US. The response that we have here is that states never really focused on it because it wasn't seen as important, and all states around the world didn't really care about COVID until people were dying, right? Which means that you can't really blame an individual country for the decisions that they didn't really have any knowledge on. But I understand the nuance of that side of the house. They say that yes, but when these people found out about this information, they opted to not do those policies. Couple of responses here. Then number one, they cared about their own constituencies more, and it's really a never-ending debate as to whether the economy is more important at the time or whether COVID was more important at the time. Mexico was struggling from people literally committing crime because the economy was shutting down as a result of pandemic restrictions, while people in America were suffering from COVID as a result of the lack of pandemic restrictions. Both these things can be equally as harmful to the individuals on the ground. This is whether the media should actively focus on those differences when it's never ending to begin with. But secondly, I argue that the people who are very, very bad at dealing with the pandemic have already been ousted from the government. You look at the UK, when Boris Johnson was given the vote of no confidence, when Bolsonaro was like punished in the election, when Lula won in the Brazilian election as a result of his really bad management of the pandemic, and how Trump was voted out by Biden. Which means that those objectively bad decisions have already been called out. I'll argue later why giving credence to them and bringing those rhetorics back is harmful. The second thing that they say is, oh, everything on our identity or economic crisis coverage would happen anyway. Well, like, first of all, this doesn't happen because you are dominating the media. This one specific thing, which is the pandemic issue, and that's how you make all of your arguments. Like that's how you get all of your benefit. But secondly, you're still making it relevant. You have to debate. Lastly, on closure, and this is the biggest argument, and they say it's a principal one. We argue on a response that if you want to have like in order for you to buy this argument, you have to prove to us why dominating media coverage on the victims would effectively give compensation to them. Firstly, I don't know what compensation really looks like. Is it money? Is it just airtime? Because I'd argue that it would be impossible to get that passed in the legislation in status quo because nobody really cares about the compensation for COVID. That's just that's just political climate right now. But secondly, I argue that this compensation in the form of airtime is actually not real compensation because because what you're arguing is merely a discussion by both sides of the Democratic or Republican, conservative, and liberals, which means number one, how will you feel closure if people are constantly debating? The Democrats would invalidate all the Republican policies that jeopardize a lot of the people, the health of a lot of individuals, while Republicans would invalidate the Democrats' restrictive policies because that resulted in businesses crumbling. Both those things had victims, and both those things, like how are you going to weigh this up? Because there's no real resolution to it. But secondly, if it's healthcare that's negative concern, I think there are natural reasons why people would have cared about healthcare regardless of pandemic issues anyway. Because number one, they don't want to suffer from the same exact problems in the past because they understood that they had no information. Secondly, we have the benefit of hindsight. Right now, we know that restrictions are good and businesses should prepare for a possible crash and recessions. We think that already is happening in status quo where people are having backup plans. But thirdly, states also have bilateral agreements with one another. So like invest in healthcare in across the abroad, but also internally as well. Budgets for healthcare have been increasing across the world, which means that these are natural incentives as to why people would have cared about the victims in other means that were more effective. Lastly, we'll argue on the comparative that actually it's better for reconciliation because these are policies that would have made a much bigger difference that would have protected the future victim as opposed to the past victim that both sides of the house would have never been able to compensate for to anyway. Argument on how the pandemic discourse gives credence to the people who did bad policies. Pandemic governments who have done policies during the pandemic and have already been punished. Bolsonaro, Trump, and Boris Johnson. But secondly, even those rhetorics on those failures have been unsuccessful in legislation right now. Biden's biggest problem before the overturning of Roe v. Wade was that he didn't do anything and he kept on harping on the failures of Trump, which means that he almost lost the midterms. And actually, it could be argued that he did lose the midterms because he was talking so much about the failures of Trump. The media coverage around these policies make these harmful actors in the past way more relevant because number one, you discuss the validity of those policies, so you debate about it, so you allow these the figures like Trump, Bolsonaro, and Boris Johnson to defend themselves in the public eye. Secondly, you use the rhetoric and you use the rhetoric and imagery surrounding the pandemic. It's quite easy to just share a video of the deaths during the COVID, and it's easy to justify that policy for restricting more people. Similarly, on vice versa as well. What are the harms to this? Number one, you attach their personality to the discussion. Given that both sides of the house agree that these are bad actors that had way worse problems just apart from COVID, you give them a lifeline to these policies and you give them a revival to their political career. Which is exactly what's happening right now. The more we talk about Trump, the more Trump becomes relevant. The more airtime we give them, the more airtime that Trump receives, which means that you mobilize those voter blocks way more, and this will be a very big stumbling block when you want to vote them out in the future. It doesn't matter if it is correct or not. All it matters is the optics of it. We give them a lifeline of affirmative.
I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the second negative speaker.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Going to start my timer first. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, we don't think that if per se government's metric in terms of equitable punishment or equitable compensation is simply punishing and kicking out politicians out of per se the policy making positions. We don't think that that is simply enough or simply what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the fact that when these types of governments actually kind of contribute to kind of massive changes to per se to kind of the root problem of COVID itself, right? Is when per se we think that the compensation is enough, right? And per se when these governments actually acknowledge the damage that they've done, to which we think that it's not necessarily very much in terms of what they've done, and we don't think that we've received enough explanation from government side of the house anyways, right? firstly, on their model, right? We think that like in terms of like elections as like a counter alternative to this, we don't think that number one, it'll have the same effect as per se you're portraying the full grievances of the people, right? Because like regardless of per se what type of like policy making, which is something that is like, as they clearly stated, a never-ending debate, then what is then important is per se those types of like grievances, right? Because regardless of whether or not per se, there has been or has been not changed within like the government, I think like what this ultimately does is per se portray like these type of like people's like grievances, right? I think like their response to this was per se to say that like, oh, we don't think that it is like important, therefore like, yeah, exactly, because like these like all other issues also have like victims, and like we think that like they think like the pandemic will dominate the media, right? Number one, we don't necessarily get why per se these types of like pandemic discussions will quote unquote dominate the media and erase all other issues, right? Because like we've already seen like the media is something that's like very multifaceted in like in terms of like what issues that they talk about regarding per se, like, oh, if you're going to like foreign policy, then it's most likely about IR issues, etc., etc., right? I think that like it's not necessarily going to be dominating exactly because like the pandemic in itself is an old issue, right? Therefore like media will still kind of like try to come up with like new hooks. We don't think that we think that they're a company, they want more clicks, therefore it won't necessarily be too unquote focused and self-centered on COVID to the point that it'll override other important issues, right? We're not saying those issues aren't important. We're saying that like COVID is still equally as important because we don't think that like there has been enough compensation or enough change in terms of like what they're doing, right? But we think that like overall, even if per se like okay. Now I'm just going to move on to like my arguments, right? Isn't that number one? Exactly because these type of like cause of the pandemic is something that is like inherent. The inherent root of it is not necessarily solved yet. Is exactly because why we shouldn't remove the governmental the like people's pressure in terms of like what they do, right? But more on that later, right? I think that like why the pandemic in itself happened is number one exactly because like, the countries in itself had very low health standards in terms of like what they're doing, right? What does this mean? This is like per se, well, you weren't mandatory, in terms like washing hands weren't necessarily mandatory, etc., etc. But we think that exactly after the pandemic kind of happened, these type of like health restrictions kind of loosened up in most areas per se. For example, in most universities, Indonesia, for example, you're not required anymore to wear a mask within like the university, etc., etc. Furthermore, we think like exactly because these type of like restrictions are getting like even more loose is why per se reckless behavior is more prone, right? We think that like a lot of like this kind of like is amplified by the fact that like COVID itself was not necessarily enough of a warning, exactly because like a lot of misinformation happened as to what COVID was, right? For example, some people believed it was a bioweapon, some people didn't even believe it existed, etc., etc., right? There is no necessarily direct change enough for there to be like for us to kind of like remove this type of like pressure outside of the media, right? But furthermore, we think that like the pandemic actually even made people more reckless, exactly because like they were just too antsy to kind of like get out and do things that they haven't done. Exactly, and we think that like this has overall kind of like caused health standards kind of like be left out exactly when the pandemic stopped, right? We think that like number two, besides the fact that governments also had low health standards, is the fact that the globalized health system response is still unestablished, right? What does this look like, right? We think like when per se this kind of like COVID broke out, a lot of governments didn't necessarily band together to kind of like solve this, and we don't think that like, a lot of governments, even after the COVID, like even till now, actually, they haven't necessarily treated it as an actual issue and haven't solved like per se. Number one, vaccine distribution is still like very much unfair and very much destabilizing of like what country gets what. Number two, the fact that the information on like the virus in itself is something that is also very much still highly politicized, and there is no yet bilateral treaty or any treaty per se that is even made within those types of like things, those types of like issues, right? Number one, vaccine transport. We think that like even till now per se, the case of like Africa and Johnson that was like recently abusing those types of people and like kind of like restricting the access to them like to vaccines even like until like 2021, end of 2021. We think that like exactly why like there is no clear system as to like how you're going to transport medical needs to kind of like these types of like undeveloped countries, etc., etc. Number two, we don't necessarily think that there's also no international treaty or no system established, exactly because like infiltrating within like per se what the virus kind of like actually is, or like specific scientist stuff. We think that like it is simply very much still politicized. This is kind of like pushed on the fact that China is still very much limited in terms of like what the US or what other countries can do with like per se the patient zero of COVID in itself, right? We think that like when you therefore remove media without these types of like necessary changes being made, or at the very least necessary changes being omitted, we think that like when citizens overall do not necessarily focus on health anymore, we think that like politicians itself will also not have like any incentive to kind of like change these types of things, and I think that it is therefore highly more risky to kind of like be infected with another type of health crisis, right? I think that like number one, politicians do not necessarily have a strong incentive without these types of like media pressure or media blaming, exactly because like they don't necessarily see the importance per se to to economy. But number two, we think that like the health also needs a lot of cooperation between actors and a lot of economic capacity, right? Besides economic capacity, right? Which we think that like those types of things don't necessarily happen without like constantly reinforcing the fact that the government's overly screwed up, right? We think that like when per se the media is still actively blaming the kind of like the actions of these like governments, then the citizens will also actively be reminded of per se the pandemic in itself, right? I think that like number one, this will be beneficial. This will kind of mean that like it'll still be within their considerations when per se they're kind of like protesting in terms of like what you can do against these systems or like policy making in general. But number two, we think that like even if per se these changes don't happen and within our side of the house, at least people are number one still more aware that these issues are still currently present. But number two, it also makes younger generations more kind of like aware to this, exactly because like they can see how long per se the media was affected or the media kind of covered these types of issues, right? To kind of like number one, set off like or portray the full grievances of people. Number two, kind of like number two, heavily kind of like how it heavily kind of like impacted the government in terms of like how slow they were on like solving the issue, right? I think that like when you have these types of like long-term impacts is when per se you'll have like you'll have when per se like the opportunity in the future kind of like arises in itself is when per se these issues will kind of like be solved, right? So we think that overall, even if per se it doesn't happen instantly, we think that it'll happen when you per se push how heavy the kind of like issue was. What to oppose?
Thank the second negative speaker for that speech and welcome the third affirmative speaker.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We can all agree that the devastating effects of the pandemic mentally and physically kill us. It took a toll on us when we couldn't meet people, and specifically, it took a toll on us when policies that were brought up by the state was one that is failure. And it's because of that we are the ones who are suffering the most because we are the victims. But since pandemic has been going on, and right now we're in a phase of endemic, should we choose to still talk about it and will we blame policies that has occurred in the past? Or should we move towards constructing a better pathway to move on from it and actually work towards our way in a world where we have post-pandemic? Two things I'll do in my speech today. First and foremost, I'll just give you a few rebuttals from the speaker before me. And secondly, I'll give you 2 issues on answering. Firstly, is it still valid to continuously blame? And secondly, how do we best move on? But let's take a look at what the speaker before me just said, right? But I also want to note out on how the first case coming from negative was that reparations for victims was the most important part for you to actually move on as a society. But then on second speaker, they just dropped it and just talk about how people just don't care about COVID anymore. And then they want to focus on just reconstructing. But also, the speaker before me talked about how highlighting in the media is the highest form of equitable punishment. I think this is not true. I think the highest form of equitable punishment, especially when it comes to just choosing our executives and our legislators, is for them to be voted out. The whole point of criticizing them in the media is so that we can get other people to see that they are the ones at fault, and then the highest form of punishment they can get is to be voted out. Or even worse, I don't know, maybe get impeachment, right? So I don't think it's necessarily true that even after they were voted out, and then the media just don't talk about it, suddenly it's not equitable punishment at all. I think this is just false. But secondly, they haven't necessarily proved to you why is it then the role of the media to deliver that equitable punishment for viewers at home, right? Because I think at least the responsibility for us as citizens to ensure that our bad MPs are accountable is for us to voice out our opinion and then vote them out, right? It's not necessarily true that the media has to continuously talk about it even after they've been voted out in order for you to get an equitable punishment. Let's move on to my first issue on is it still valid to continuously blame? The negative team contend to you in this issue that firstly, it is the best form of compensation because you get catharsis from it, because maybe your family members have died due to the effects of the bad policies, and this is the only way for you to move on. Three problems I have with this. First and foremost, we are not abandoning the conversations around COVID. In fact, post-COVID reconciliation is what we're going to focus on. We're still going to talk about the issues of what happens after the pandemic due to COVID, but we're slightly just going to focus more on how do we better improve ourselves instead of just looking at the past and what should have been better as made by the previous MPs, right? But also we just want to stop blaming altogether. The second problem towards this case is, are we actually forgiving the MPs? I think no, because throughout the time when we are having that pandemic, we are continuously criticizing the state throughout the pandemic. And also we had several elections where it became the battleground for individuals to actually vote individuals out. So we're not necessarily forgiving them, we're exactly pushing them away. And because they are the reasons why we are in a mess in the first place, we're ensuring that individuals had the right to actually vote them out in the first place. The question and the burden now that negative has to answer is, what is the tipping point for the continuous highlight of the failure? Or rather, what is the value of that continuous form of highlighting of this failure, right? If we were to argue it's just a form of just to give reparations towards victims, I think we've already done that throughout the pandemic where we actually vote them out. And the last problem is, we're not saying that states are actually free from any accountability or that it's not their fault. What we've been saying from the first speaker is that, and the second speaker as well, is that any policies would have different repercussions. For example, if there were no restrictions of movement and a lot of people can just focus on the economy and actually be more prosperous, the problem with that is that the cases went up and a lot more people died. But in other states where there weren't restrictions of movement, a lot of people actually lost their jobs. So either way, the point that we're trying to establish is because COVID was entirely new to us, and that while sure we had control of the policies we can make, the external effects that were actually placed upon the legislators to make the best form of policies were the causation of why a lot of the policies turned out to be bad. So what we're trying to say here is MPs from the beginning have been trying to balance out our competing rights and our competing incentives to ensure that we have the best form of policies. Therefore, accountability and criticism at that time were valid, but right now it's not. What do we then contend under this issue on whether it's still valid or not? We say that when you continuously highlight the failures of the state, it's going to be a waste of their time because people have limited time on their hands, so they will just consume the most important parts of the news, right? And while it's not necessarily problematic for individuals to just consume the best or the most important part of the news, the problem is that the media shapes social narratives. The more you talk about it, the more they're going to focus on that even more. And Negative's response toward this was just a low attack, right? Because they say we're still going to talk about other issues. We're still going to talk about the economy and also IR as well. But the problem here is that you've already conceded that the highest form of compensation for these individuals, for the victims, is for you to continuously talk about it. And if this was to be true, then basically any other forms of news wouldn't matter at all to them because we only want to focus on blaming these individuals. So therefore, we've established that it's no longer valid for media to actually continuously blame the policies that have failed in the past. Let's take a look at the second issue then, on how do we best move on from it. What we've been contending from my second speaker is that how we get to reshape political climate. The hazard that exists on the side of negative is it becomes a reductive policies because it's precisely because people would just blame the past government and would easily believe that the alternative is much better. While sure, it would look good in America where during the whole pandemic, Trump was the bad actor and a lot of people were blaming Trump and then they instantly believed that Biden is going to be a good alternative. But in other cases as well, a lot of people will also work on vice versa. What if Biden were the one to actually be what if Biden were the one to actually deal with the effects of post-pandemic, right? A lot of people will instantly blame Biden for all the repercussions that has happened, and then they're going to lean towards the alternative that is probably the Republicans or individuals who are actually worse off under their side of the house. So the way we get to actually reshape the way we get to actually move on from this issue is we reshape the social narratives regarding post-COVID, right? It's precisely because of the fact now that we have more airtime to spend on how do we best reconcile with the whole country, because the main problem during the pandemic was this unity. We also get to pick and choose how are we able to actually reconstruct how individuals should focus on certain political issues as going to be important for them. Specifically, probably we're going to talk more about how right now, maybe the state of the COVID has made us so to think that education is probably no longer important, or just to focus more on gig economy that is actually essentially good for certain individuals. These are all the kind of conversations that's going to be absent in the world of negative, which is primarily good for us. What is the then comparative under the side of negative, right? How can a dominating media change people's mind? I think if they were to concede that the media is so visceral on just giving this reparation towards its victims, they have no other forms of incentive to actually care about what's going to happen like in the future. Because it's just more intuitive to believe that if you've stuck on in the past, you can't necessarily move on from that. I think it's much better on the outside of the house because we're giving them some form of incentive to actually look past towards the state failures that we've already criticized in the past. Never been proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the third affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the third negative speaker.
Hi, chicken, am I audible?
Yep.
All right, thank you so much. We're pronouncing him. We're going to start in 3, 2, 1. Two things I'll do in my speech. First, I'll deal with the new materials brought by third speaker and their entire response to our counter-model. Second, I'll explain why government should hold accountable and why this is the prerequisite for you to establish the future policy exclusively in our subclass. Firstly, I'll deal with the new materials brought by third speaker and their entire response to our counter-model. What did they say? First, they say that they never understand why this motion apparently existing, because there are a lot of things that government failed and yet to do where they promised to do so, like what we established in first speaker. E.g., compensation in forms of money, etc. is something that they never answer with. Why the family of COVID victims could get the fairness? Why all of the corrupt politicians can hold accountable in their house, never getting an answer to this. Second, this is not an actor-based motion based on perspective of media, but it should be viewed based on the third person perspective. But I'll deal with this given the fact that they're framing this as an actor-based motion. Number one, media will be incentivized anyway to expose government simply because it's garnering more profit. Second, simply because media is one and only platform from opposition to check and balance the incumbent government, so this response is washed. Thirdly, they say that affirmative is not necessarily forgiving them in their side, but again, I think this is the fiat that we established earlier. When the failures are not highlighted, there are three things that might happen. Number one, a lot of politicians will get away from the punishment because of their incompetency, simply because there is no societal demands and pressure, or people who defend the grievances from the vulnerable actor. Second, the bad party who failed to solve pandemic or prolong the pandemic could still stay in power because it's not being glorified anymore. Violate the principle of justice and retribution, something that they failed to engage with. Thirdly, concentrate in political discussion like what third speaker established is a wash, because even after the pandemic, most of the political discussion is still also concentrated in pandemic result of whether you manage that to solve the pandemic or not. So you agree that our case is the prerequisite for their case to happening. Lastly, therefore, the vast majority of their case is a wash, and at best is just mitigatory to the vast majority of our case. Second issue, I'll explain why government should hold accountable and why this is the prerequisite for you to establish the future policy exclusively on our side. What did they say? Number one, government is lacking out information, therefore they are apparently unable to make proper decisions based on first speaker in our case. I have a roughly true response to this. First of all, this is just untrue. Pandemic happening a lot of times, influenza in Spain, Ebola in Africa, etc. So ultimately you can learn in the history how to handle this, e.g. when you need to correctly shut down and doing isolation, for instance, to cut out the pandemic distribution. So therefore this proof by government is culpable in principle. More additional reasons in this. Number one, simply because there are also countries that are apparently successful to handle this, e.g. Germany, who successfully locked down and pressed the COVID victims during the Angela Merkel time. When there are countries who are apparently failed, like Trump in US, ultimately because government is incompetent, therefore they deserve criticism even after the pandemic. Second, if they think government is still confused, is it something that they apparently consider too? That means government is incompetent. Because I would suggest as government, you need to prepare even for worse circumstance, given the externalities might arising. Look, the analogy in here for you to believe our claim is natural disaster like earthquake might happening and we don't have control over it. But if government have more incentive to quickly and evacuate people first, we can minimize the victims of this earthquake anyway. Therefore, affirmative cannot say that the government should be get away from check and balance from media. Second response, they say that there is an accurate information from the WHO and country following them anyway. Sure, given the fact that this is true on their side, but you need to understand several things. Number one, oftentimes WHO already admit this mistake, right? And fix their standard, ultimately subsidize and standardize the mass monopoly, for instance. Therefore, WHO did a reparative obligation. But ultimately, what you need to understand is that the pandemic or COVID-19, for instance, is oftentimes evolving. WHO don't really wrong in this case because in the first phase or in the first stage, the COVID is not deathly. But after the second phase and third phase, after the continuous monitor, the COVID become deathly, right? WHO revised their standard, but countries and politicians are often still underestimating this. What does this look like? This looks like still prioritizing economic, given the fact that WHO already revised their standard, thinking COVID is just conspiracy, for instance. Therefore, the victims are existing in massive quantity because government failed to adapt with WHO new standard. Second, given after that, the treatment brought down by government was incredibly lacking, e.g. unprepared of providing people with proper healthcare facilities, being incredibly late in providing financial aid for poor people. Because of this inefficient distribution, we should hold government accountable because what amplified the harm of pandemic is government themselves by things such as corruption, because vaccine business are incredibly profitable, by complex bureaucracy on how there are a lot of discussions to do lockdown policy or not. There are a lot of conservative politicians who enforce belief that vaccine is incredibly bad and it's just being like a monitor for you from the Google, for instance. Therefore, government is simply culpable. The thing is, all the government violation in their side cannot be highlighted anyway, so that the corrupt politicians are not get the proper punishment. The poor people didn't have the compensation being distributed. The family from the COVID victims, for instance, have no justice for their identity, right? We prove to you why this is far more important, because if this is not being highlighted by the media, who will provide them with protection? Simply because they're the most vulnerable in here, affirmatively failed to bring them protection because that is their trade-off that they failed to defend. Thirdly, like in another scenario, following their case, they told you that government already held accountable during pandemic. Therefore, we need to know prolonging this problem. But number one, if government is already highlighted and being check and balance anyway, they never explain why this is enough. Apparently, media during the pandemic have the incentive to minimize check and balance simply because it will cause people panicking and going riot in the street. Therefore, the only proper time to check the government to hold accountable is only after the pandemic. Is that probably the pandemic's already over. We recognize how it's better for corruptor to get punishment, how when we highlight these people, we'll have and sympathize poor people who are become the victims of this COVID, help them financially and ultimately give them the compensation that they deserve, change the minister, for instance, who failed to handle COVID by the minister who is able to bring the economic development under our house. So again, compensation is the prerequisite for you to manifest the change in their side. The second thing I will talk about is that their arguments about media should focus on moving on toward the next policy. Number one, compensation and aid is the prerequisite for you to revitalize the economy. If more people getting aid in forms of money that they deserve when government failed to provide this, number one, it will increasing and developing the buyer's capability in the market. Therefore, more people consume commodity and service, more producer incentivized to produce more. This is what we prioritize in first that they fail to engage with. Second, even if this is not true, but compensation is far more important in principle because investment will ultimately still come anyway in our state simply because of interdependency and there are an urgent needs to provide more profit. At the same time, we can also highlight the media. So again, their benefit is not really exclusive in their side of the house. Second response, they say that this gives never-ending cycle. I suggest this is a logical fallacy because given the fact this is true, number one, their counterfactual of re-election could only be mechanized and benefit if you expose the incumbent government mistakes. So in the next election, people have full information of which party could they elect to revitalize the economy, only exclusive on our house. When you have the full awareness of how sucks incumbent government handling COVID, therefore you might able to enhance your rationality to the certain extent that you might able to have full information of which parties that you need to choose and which party that you need to prioritize on the next election. Second, moreover, compensation is the prerequisite for you to hold and revitalize the economic because investor will not ultimately invest in a country that's still in shambles, that their politics are still full of corruption, who are not held accountable with, the vulnerable actor who are still not getting any compensation, simply because that is bad for the investor and for the company's image to begin with. On our side, we fix this. We give justice for people and crucially fix the image from the country so that investment is coming exponentially on our side in the condition of stability after the compensation and justice was being delivered. We win in 4 metrics. Number one, we prove that stability brings you more revenue and investment only after you deliver justice and compensation for people. And crucially, why this incentivizes for more people to buying and make the economic cycle functionize again. So if you buy their practical benefit, you need to vote for negative because we recognize how their case is likely to run. Second, simply at the same time, in principle, we prove why grievances from the people are something that's far more important in here. Again, in principle, because a vulnerable actor will not get any validation on their side, any support, any protection if it's not being started from media. Thirdly, we prove against, in principle, why government is ultimately culpable, given they don't have full information of it. It even emphasized the further incompetency of government to not learn from the past precedents of previous pandemic cases that is already happening, even before COVID. And because this is the result of them being so careless, therefore they are culpable and should be held accountable. Fourthly and lastly, if media is shaping societal narrative by the concession from their speaker, it's great, because the prerequisite for their case to run is to hold the government accountable in our side, to not holding people skeptic because of government, to attract more people participation because they understand that the new government, for instance, or the government right now already contributed and atone all of their sins and all of their mistakes for the vulnerable actor and for the failures that they did during the pandemic. Based all those 4 points, we win.
I'd like to thank the third negative speaker for that speech and welcome the negative reply.
Alright, I'm going to share my timer first. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. This debate is about choosing the better treatment after COVID, right? Which is like in government side house, they are going to choose to go into the transition, and under our side house, we want to focus on recovery, right? However, the government case here assumes that our case is about being stuck in the past and we cannot like make any action. We already proved to you, like from my LO's deal and that UNWIP, that it is not exactly about stuck in the past, but it is about maintaining that the government checking their promises over the pandemic recovery, because this kind of policy is exactly very influential toward the future policy which currently being made, and it's also consciously influential toward the way in which we tackle the economic crisis which are going to happen. I think the biggest problem in our business of government is that they never characterize the media incentive in these two different issues. Well, we already told you the different characteristic of the media incentive is upon the ability for them to highlight this kind of past issues, which is exactly very determined to consciously make the government accountable within the issues. However, there is no any characterization of media incentive under their side house, therefore the cases does not mechanize at best, right? I think but then they told you that what they want to have in this debate is about focusing upon recovery, when we already told you that the pandemic debate is exactly the only way for you to focus on recovery, because this is the only way for you to actually consciously by the people to maintain the political compromises by the government, by building the infrastructure, by consciously balancing the economical growth and the healthcare infrastructure, etc. The only reason that they told you is that, oh, because most likely the government has a valid attributability, therefore they don't need to be responsible. However, I think at the same time, they never actually, the logical link, which is still missing upon their arguments, is about how the pandemic amnesty could incentivize government to be better, right? Because even like until the last speaker, we actually never get on the reasons why that the pandemic amnesty exactly are going to create a better economical growth. It's going to like creating a better capacities to post-COVID reconciliation that they told you in the very first place. When we already told you a lot of likelihood and a lot of level of analysis as to why it is likely that the post-COVID reconciliation and the people compensation can only be categorized throughout this post-pandemic process. Then upon the culpability, they told you that this is most likely something which is not in the negligence and the control maintenance. We told you that even if it is true, this is not the most important thing, because even if it is true that it is not in the full controls over the state, but there is still the responsibility of the state to be responsible toward their societies, because regardless whether or not it is their negligence, but the consequences is exactly something that they need to focus upon, because there is something which is internally already being responsibility over the state. And this is exactly where our argumentation about the ability to form the compensation, this is the ability for us to actually getting a retribution of justice is important, because there is also it is not also tangible upon the metrics of capability, but it is upon the metrics of the state responsibility after the post-COVID reconciliation and how they are going to maintain it in the very first place. We told you about the ability for us to mitigate the consequences that are going to be happen in the very first thing, right? But then upon then they told you that most likely there will be like, you know, the blaming of the leaders, because there is going to like plunge out their meme, therefore they could like maximize the voters because the people are going to be so biased, etc. I think my beauty leader proposition are the response to you that this is most likely very unlikely, because most likely we told you the characteristic of the pandemic issues debate is exactly victim focused, and also like most likely focusing upon the failure of the blaming, I think that the society that we talk here is most likely the rational societies. Therefore, the argumentation is not important, right? But then they also talk to you about the economic crisis, that the only way for them to actually like focus upon the economic crisis and after post-COVID reconciliation is exactly throughout this thing. But then, but the logical link which is also still missing is how that the government is going to be incentivized, right, after this post, by abandoning this kind of ignoring, because they consciously always talk about because we are going to abandon, therefore they are going to incentivize to focus. We told you that it is unlikely, because most likely the only way for you to actually making them to incentivize is only through this. But secondly, we also told you that the pandemic debate, exactly because the pandemic debate still exists, this is exactly the only way for you to like to attract foreign direct investment, because they are going to feel protected, they are going to feel safe, because there is still the issue over the healthcare that is being concerned about by the government. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the negative reply speaker and welcome the affirmative reply.
Both teams agree that this debate exists in the status quo, which means number one, the pandemic is almost over. Number two, bad politicians objectively have been voted out because elections have happened. And thirdly, there are other issues that have arisen. Burden on negative then is why is there still a necessity given that there are mechanisms in society to prevent COVID in the future already? Because we argue to you how all of the objectively bad politicians have already been punished, and there is no necessity to remind other politicians because those politicians have already been left behind. Which means that if you want to materialize the argument on compensation, you have to prove how this media coverage would have unseated the other people who remain in office. And absent of this mechanism, you don't get to claim the benefits on accountability because the accountability doesn't even get mobilized to begin with. Two observations. Firstly, on observations on the compensation argument. They argue that this won't dominate the media because there are other issues like IR and econs. But then they still argue that you still want to compensate the victims. First observation here is that if you want massive buy-in, you need to dominate the media, which means that you have to trade off the economic crisis in status quo as opposed to others. If you concede that you also have other problems, then it reduces the efficacy of compensation to the victims. Secondly, how can you even give compensation to the victims through media? Like, where are you going to get this buy-in to give the money from? Because there is no politician right now is arguing for it. But thirdly, you drop this argument and then you argue to us why what's important now is preparation, so I don't think this is important. Secondly, we got away with the argument on how we should not give political resurgence to obviously immoral actors in the discussion, because this is important, because even negative concedes that these actors are bad, Trumps and Bolsonaros of the world, because of their toxicity. But the problem then is, if you buy this argument that opposition gives toxicity a second chance in the next election, which means you mobilize the opposition more, and they suffer all of the same harms of how there is more rhetorics about like denying COVID and stuff like that, because these are the champions of those rhetorics to begin with. This argument above everything else because because you prevent accountability from happening in the future, and you make it so that it's harder to actually vote for the correct party out. First issue then on was it really valid? Were the responses of the incumbent party valid? The response from opposition is that it's valid because it's invalid because people don't take it seriously in status quo. We argued the frame that we are already out of the pandemic, which means even if there are people who don't take it seriously, it's quite negligible because we're already almost out of the pandemic. But secondly, there are also unnatural reasons to not just give up. And the healthcare system will always try their best to prevent this from happening because they have a preservation, like they want to preserve the healthcare system as well. But the difference on op is that the narrative is different. The narrative is that healthcare is the primary concern, even though it isn't in society. And that's the problem because now you negate every other policy making decision and you make it hard for you to have constructive decision making or policy making, because this is an issue that will always win as opposed to other issues. We argue how other issues were more important. This last issue on preparation, they argued how you need the media to make people realize. But we told you how people wouldn't have realized anyway, with or without it, because we're already out of the pandemic and other issues matter more to them. But the role of the media was never to make people realize on past failures. It's to always report on current issues and urgent ones. They have never taken down our analysis on how urgent policies require the urgent coverage. Therefore, on all those grounds, we have to take this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the affirmative reply speaker for that